Hello, friends! Absolutely everybody knows what the Titanic of all sunken ships. It's been over a century since the catastrophe, so why did nobody lift the famous liner to the surface? Well, let's try to figure it out. Passengers survived. Many of the victims of the tragedy were rich people, so their relatives immediately wanted to raise the Titanic from the bottom. But despite having lots of money, it was impossible to carry out this operation. And it wasn't just because of the technology, which, of course, was very different in the early 20th century. The problem was the exact coordinates of the Titanic were unknown. It seems incredible. How can you lose a huge liner? But don't forget, the ship sank not in some small bay, but in the middle of the North Atlantic. And even considering it was a 269-meter-long ship, it wasn't easy to find. In addition, during the long dive, the ship was drifting, and although the radio operators gave the exact coordinates, the Titanic could move in any direction while sinking. And also remember that the ship broke in two, which doubled the complexity of the search. People proposed different ways of lifting the ship in the case of its discovery, using a submarine equipped with electromagnets, using magnets attached to pontoons to make the ship's hull raise to the surface. But in the midst of the discussion, the First and then the Second World Wars happened, and the idea of raising the Titanic was temporarily forgotten. Then, in 1953, people started talking again about the sunken liner. At the site of the alleged location of the Titanic, a British ship-raising company made attempts to make a map of the ocean floor with the help of echoes from explosions. But again, no luck. By the way, people didn't want to raise the huge ship simply out of love for history. According to some documents, inside the Titanic, there was a collection of jewelry worth about $300 million. In addition, there was the original version of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and the mummy of an ancient Egyptian princess, and also many of the passengers took their jewels on board, a whole underwater treasure. In 1966, Englishman Douglas Wally launched a $5 million project to find the Titanic. He wanted to somehow find the liner and then enclose it with plastic containers with water, passing an electric current through them, thus generating gases that would raise the ship. And if this idea seems absurd to you, then wait to hear other options to raise the Titanic. Here are a couple of examples. Freeze the hull from the inside with liquid nitrogen, forcing the liner to float to the surface like an ice cube in a glass. Waiter, there's a Titanic in my cocktail. Or fill the ship with ping pong balls. Imagine how many balls you would need. Despite the huge number of ideas, they were all useless because people simply didn't know where the ship was. Until, finally, in 1985, the deep submergence vehicle Argo started an underwater voyage and found the stern of the Titanic. Turns out the wreckage of the Titanic was scattered over an area with a radius of 1,600 meters at a depth of about 3,800 meters. No wonder nobody could find it. The bow of the ship went deep into the ground under the weight of its own body. The stern was found 800 meters from the bow. The remains of the middle part of the hull were nearby, and around it, many small objects like dishes, candlesticks, and other household things were found. Despite the fact that all these things were well preserved, the ship itself was in a very poor condition. They even placed a special sign at the bow of the Titanic asking not to touch the liner. Later, experts found that the Titanic was so damaged because of the seawater and all kinds of shellfish that any attempt to raise it would lead to the destruction of the hull. But even with the researchers out of the picture, the ship is slowly decaying. One reason is the tourist excursions to the ship. Sadly, people try to take home details of the Titanic. For example, the ship's bell with the mast beacon mysteriously disappeared. And doubtfully crabs borrowed them. In 2004, an international agreement was signed to protect the Titanic disaster site, as well as its debris lying on the bottom. Later, in 2012, the ship was taken under the protection of UNESCO, and it was simply impossible to raise it. Now, the Titanic is an underwater cultural heritage, and therefore must be underwater. Logic, right? Anyway, despite all this, we would never see the Titanic on the surface. The ship is quickly collapsing under the influence of water and bacteria, which is literally devouring the metal. According to the scientists' forecasts, some parts of the ship would be destroyed in 20 to 30 years, and after another century, we will no longer recognize the legendary Titanic.